Hi, my name is Erick Medina, and this is my presentation on when police use of force is legally justified. So, a quick introduction. Use of force refers to the level of physical control or coercion of when an officer uses compliance in a situation. Legally, officers are allowed to use force, but only under specific conditions under the Constitution and from past court rulings. Use of force is necessary in many situations involving self-defense, protecting members of the public, or preventing a suspect from escaping. Every use of force situation must be reviewed under legal standards according to multiple laws, even if it was justified or excessive. About 1.3% of police public interactions involve any use of force, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And this number tends to go up for minorities. It goes up to 4% for African Americans and then 3% for Hispanics. A key amendment in this topic is the Fourth Amendment, which protects individuals from unreasonable searches and seizures. When police use force to detain or arrest someone, it's technically considered a seizure under the law. Any level of force used must meet the standard of reasonableness, and courts evaluate whether the officer's actions were reasonable based on the situation in the moment. And the amendment is the primary constitutional foundation for all police use in the nation. My first case that I'll be talking about is Tennessee versus Garner that happened in 1985. So a quick background about this case. In 1974, Memphis police shot and killed 15-year-old Edward Garner while he was fleeing a home burglary. Garner was unarmed at the time, but he was still shot and killed under a Tennessee law that authorized deadly force against a fleeing individual or felon. Pretty much the case just established rules for when deadly force can be used on fleeing suspects. Now police cannot use deadly force unless the suspect poses an immediate threat or danger to members of the public. In this case, Garner was unarmed. Garner posed no threat to the public. Garner should not have been shot. But yeah, this case overturned previous laws that allowed shooting any fleeing suspect, like this Tennessee law that resulted in Garner being killed. And it stated that deadly force is only justified when necessary to prevent harm to officers or members of the public. And this case placed constitutional limits on police shootings that involved fleeing suspects. And then for my second case will be Graham versus Connor, 1989. Graham, who was a diabetic, was experiencing a low blood sugar reaction and asked a friend to take him to a store so he could buy orange juice to get his blood sugar back to normal. Graham left the store after staying in long line. He was impatient, didn't want to wait, so he just left. And then Officer Connor, who was outside, saw this action and suspected Graham of petty theft. Despite explanations from Graham and Graham's friend, Officer Connor handcuffed Graham, causing severe injuries like a broken foot and a shoulder injury. After this action by Officer Connor, Graham sued, alleging excessive force, but lower courts applied a malicious and sadistic intent standard, which is harder to prove in a court. Later on, this case went from a lower court to eventually the Supreme Court, where they ruled from unanimously 9-0 that excessive force claims during an arrest should not be evaluated based on the officer's intent, but rather on whether their actions were reasonable. Then for my third case, just Scott versus Harris, which occurred in 2007. Harris fled a traffic stop, starting a high-speed chase. Harris was going way beyond the speed limit, going, I believe, around from 90 miles per hour to 100, which is way over the speed limit in any state in this country. Deputy Scott saw the threat that Harris was posing from going really fast, so he ran Harris's vehicle to end the threat, causing a crash, because since Harris was going really fast and Deputy Scott hit him, he had a pretty, we could say that he got hurt pretty bad, because he was going really fast. Yeah, so caused a crash, and it left Harris disabled, paralyzed, severe injuries. After this, Harris argued that the force used was excessive and it violated his Fourth Amendment rights. So then the Supreme Court took on this case, and in an 8-1 decision, the court held that a police officer's attempt to terminate a dangerous high-speed car chase that threatens the lives of innocent bystanders does not violate the Fourth Amendment. So this ruling established that video evidence clearly contradicts a plaintiff's story for summary judgment purposes, because in this case, the dash cam video of Deputy Scott was used, and in the dash cam video you could clearly see the speeds, the dangerous speeds that Scott was going, and the threat that he posed to the public. And little fact, only about 2% of people who interact with police report being injured during use of force incidents. So it's not like this is a common issue, because in this country, we have thousands of people who run from the police on a daily basis. And we as a public, we see what the news tells us, what the media tells us. And the media, they're not going to tell us, oh, like this individual got hurt during a chase and broke his elbow. We don't see that. We usually see the bigger stories about when someone was like disabled, kind of like in this case, Harris, or when the suspect was left heavily injured. We as a public usually think like, oh, like this must happen a lot more. But in reality, it never really occurs. Only 2% of people report being injured. And technically, in this case, being injured could mean a broken elbow or a broken hand. It doesn't mean like a life-threatening injury. So yeah. And then for my last case, the most recent one, is Plumhoff versus Ricard, which happened in 2014. Ricard, he took off from a traffic stop, kind of like our previous case. He took off from a traffic stop and led police on a high-speed chase. And eventually, they were able to stop him, and he got cornered by multiple police cars. But Ricard didn't stop there. He kept trying to escape, and he kept ramming his vehicle back and forth into the vehicles of the officers in an attempt to escape. And this resulted in officers firing into Ricard and his vehicle, killing him and the passenger. That was with Ricard. This case went up to the Supreme Court, where they ruled that their actions were reasonable under these circumstances. The court emphasized that suspects who create deadly danger to the public may justify strong police action. And the court noted that a driver cannot rely on the danger they placed their own passenger and to argue that police acted unreasonably. And I say this because in Ricard's defense, they argued that officers shouldn't have shot into the vehicle because of the passenger, because technically the passenger did no wrong in this situation. The passenger isn't the one who took off, not the one who led the police in the high-speed chase. So technically, in this case, the passenger was pretty innocent. He wasn't the one who ran the police cars. And so they argued that they shouldn't have shot into the vehicle because of the passenger in the vehicle. But the court noted that the driver cannot rely on the danger that they placed their own passenger. So it was legally justified that the shooting was okay, that it was not excessive force. And since Ricard himself was ramming into police vehicles, the police argued that because a vehicle is a deadly weapon. I think that should be common sense. You could kill someone with a vehicle. You can run over someone with a vehicle. And so ramming your car into other cars, police cars, or into other officers, that was legally justified in this case, which resulted in the death of Ricard. And then moving on to the topic of police use of force policies. Every police department, state agency, county sheriff's office across the U.S., they all have laws, use of force laws that officers must follow. These laws are based on constitutional law and Supreme Court rulings, like the previous four that I talked about. Force must always follow multiple principles, such as necessity, like when force is needed to control the situation. Proportionality, when force matches the threat level. And then reasonableness, when a trained officer would do in the same situation. Officers, they receive multiple training on legal use of force standards. When they go through the academy, like here in California, it's called the Post Academy. They go over several laws, and then they're trained on if they have to use excessive force, what kind of it, because if you have to tackle someone, you don't want to tackle them to the ground and then start breaking their arm or their leg, just the use of force necessary to apprehend a suspect. And then if you violate any of these laws, it can lead to being disciplined or terminated or even facing criminal charges if you kill the suspect. We've seen this multiple times recently too. I think the last major event of this kind was the George Floyd incident, when officers had Floyd on the ground trying to cuff him, and then one officer had his knee to the back of Floyd's neck, which resulted in Floyd not being able to breathe and Floyd ultimately dying. That is a result of excessive force and criminal charges, because 3 or 4 officers involved, I got sentenced and are currently in jail. There's multiple levels of force. Usually, the most basic one, the number one, would be officer presence, which means like the officer being there, like talking to you, you know. And then number two usually have verbal commands when an officer will tell you like step out the vehicle or like put your hands on top of your head or behind your back, stuff like that. And then you have empty hand control, which means physical restraint. So pretty much, if an officer has to tackle you to the ground or like fight with you to put you in handcuffs, pretty much what empty hand control means. And then after that, you have less lethal methods, which means like tasers, being tased, or being pepper sprayed, or an officer using their baton on you. And then the last one, lethal force, which means being shot, a firearm, or another tool that's capable of causing death. So all these go into laws that every single police officer must follow and abide by. And then we'll go into how use of force laws help law enforcement. Laws like the Fourth Amendment and rulings such as Graham versus Connor provide clear guidelines for when force is allowed. These legal standards help officers make quick decisions in high pressure situations, because as we all know, in an event, let's say an active shooter event, if an officer goes into the building, they don't really have time to think about like, oh, like what should I do? Like, they don't have time to think because of the circumstances. So by knowing these legal standards, it helps officers know that like, oh, okay, I have to do this. They don't really have to think about it because they don't have time to think about it. If it's a school shooting, you want the officers in right away, neutralizing the threat. You don't want them sitting outside just thinking about it while people get shot and killed. So that's why officers they're trained and they're taught all these legal standards so that they know the quick decisions that they must make. And so that they can act confidently knowing that their actions are supported if they follow the law. Because I'm sure that officers, they don't want to think that they're doing the right thing, but then that they didn't, and that they just go to jail. I'm sure no officer wants that. And then having clear rules allow for consistency in how officers use force across different situations and departments, because every department does have their own set of rules. Even though they're usually similar, each department might have different rules here and there. It's really common. It helps the officers protect themselves from physical harm and from harm from the legal system. And these laws help minimize harm, and they help foster better relationships between the police and the community. Because you don't want officers out in the streets that are causing harm and havoc to the people. You want officers who follow the law. And then we'll move on to why courts often rule force is justified. So, courts evaluate police actions to see if they're reasonable from standards from like Graham versus Connor. Courts understand that police officers have to make split-second decisions in dangerous situations. Kind of like how I talked about in our last slide, how in the active shooter situation. Most of the time, officers don't have time to think about all the possibilities. It could mean life or death to most of them. So they often just they usually do the first thing that comes to mind. So that's why judges evaluate cases based on what the officer knew at the exact moment of the incident. That's why in every single excessive force case, even if it was legally justified or not, they review the whole case. Usually they'll take a report from the officer, they'll take reports of witnesses, they'll look at the body cam footage, and they'll decide if what the officer knew at the moment was justified. And the legal standard doesn't require officers to be perfect, only reasonable, because, well, I'm sure common sense, but in the heat of a moment, I'm sure it would be tough for an officer to be perfect. So, the law says as long as you're reasonable, then you should be fine. And then courts often prioritize public safety when evaluating the reasonableness of force. Studies have shown that over 75% of use of force incidents involve resistance or threats from suspects. In use of force cases, about 75% involve suspects actively resisting or threatening officers, according to the DOJ, Department of Justice. And then finally, we have the impact of use of force laws and cases. Supreme Court rulings such as Graham versus Connor and Tennessee versus Garner helped establish national standards for police conduct, for standards that we use to this day. These laws provide clear guidelines that help officers respond effectively in high-risk situations. These legal standards help protect officers when they act within the law and follow proper procedures. And at the same time, these laws place limits on the use of force to protect the individual's constitutional rights. So these laws are meant to help law enforcement officers and the public at the same time. They're not meant to benefit one side. They're meant to create justice and benefit the correct side of the incident. These laws have a huge influence on police training and department policies and accountability systems, because it's good to hold law enforcement accountable when needed. I'm sure no one in this country wants like a power-hungry cop who thinks that they can just do whatever and tackle people to the ground whenever. That's why we have these laws, so that the officers don't have too much power. I mean, overall, these laws help create a balance between effective law enforcement and protection of the public. But I mean, even then, not a lot of police interactions result in the use of deadly force. According to the Washington Post police shooting database, less than 0.01% of all police interactions result in the use of deadly force. Before doing this presentation, I thought that number was probably higher, because when we look at the news and we see something about police-related incidents, we usually see like, oh, the police shot this person. So we as a public, or most of the public, think that this probably happens more often. I thought that police shootings happen more often than that, but 0.01% is a very low percentage, which I was surprised about until I did my research. But yeah. And then, yeah, that's my presentation. So